I don't know if the Pope is that familiar with our calendar, but with the World Day of the Poor, in our country, it's always going to fall around Thanksgiving. And I think it's a great time for us to kind of take stock. We're coming to the end of the liturgical year. We're getting ready for the new calendar year in January. So it will be a good time for us to always use this day to do what he wanted it to do in the first place. And that's to think about, kind of evaluate what I am doing for the poor. Now, the problem is, a lot of times, that we've kind of institutionalized it. So after the Second Vatican Council, a lot of parishes had social justice committees. And so that gave those people for whom that's important, they could kind of take care of those people. But it didn't really do anything to the rank and file. Okay? Well, this is really about what each of us does. Now, why is that important, you might ask? Well, if you look at all of Jesus' teaching in the New Testament, the focus of the teaching was always on the poor and always on the marginalized. That's who he talked about all the time. And so he hung out with the ne'er-do-wells. He was feeding people and healing people. It's really why he came. And so we take a look at that and say, okay, how does that kind of apply to us? And one of the ways I'd like to have you think about it is in terms of the song that we used to sing a lot in the 60s and 70s, whatsoever you do to the least of my people. Yeah, that you do unto me. And so I think that at the end of time, and I preach to myself as much as I do to you, that really I don't think Jesus is going to care how many novenas we prayed. Now, if those novenas made us more conscious and more compassionate and more generous, then wonderful. But if it didn't, if it was just about me taking care of myself and getting my own little hiney to heaven, then they were really worthless. And so we have this great gospel, and again, this only comes up in this cycle, but what a great one to inaugurate the World Day of the Poor. And it's the parable of the 5 talents. Now, you heard the story, pretty easy. A couple things you need to understand. First of all, the word talent in Jesus' time and the way it was used in the scripture doesn't mean what we use today. Okay? So a talent was a unit of money. It was a very large unit of money. Okay? So if he gave him 5 talents, that was a big load. That was a big contribution, a big entrustment. Okay? And the 2 and the 1. So first of all, the talent was a large sum of money. But the second thing that I don't want you to miss is the line that came right before that. It said he was going to go on a long journey, so he called his servants in and entrusted his possessions. Now, there's 2 really important words there. Entrusted and possessions. Now, if it was just giving something, okay, it was just giving something, then you can do with it what you want. It didn't say he gave it to them. It said he entrusted it. So if I entrust something to you, first of all, it's not yours. You need to take care of it. Why? Because it was mine in the first place. And if something is entrusted to us, a good example would be if you ask somebody to be a sponsor for a baby to be baptized. You're entrusting that which is yours, the kid. You're entrusting their spiritual well-being for the future to somebody else. That's why it makes no sense for us to have somebody be a sponsor at a baptism who doesn't go to church. In fact, we try to verify whether or not they're practicing. Makes no sense to entrust your child's spiritual life to somebody who doesn't take care of their own. Okay? So it's an entrustment, huh? Entrusted his possessions, okay? Now, that's what it meant in Jesus' time. What does it mean in our time? I don't think you're saying, well, I have 5 talents. I have 5 very largeable units of money, okay? For us, it really means what you probably thought it meant during the gospel. What are the talents that God has given you? What capacities has God given you? What God-given abilities has God given you? They are not yours. They are not mine. God expects a return on those investments. God expects a return on those investments. So, for example, I think I've told you before that when I went away to college, You know, when I went from Waterloo to college, I thought I was a pretty big dog, you know, musically, and I could really play well and everything. I got to college, and guess what? There were people who were better than I was. And so I kind of backed off from doing stuff. And when I first started to notice it was when you'd go to parties, and they'd say, well, John, why don't you play something? And I'd say, no, she really plays better than I do, or he really plays better than I do. But what I also noticed is the people who had a lot more talent never did it. So finally I decided, I don't care if somebody in the room is better than I am. If they ask me to play, I'm going to play. And I'm glad I did. So we're supposed to use what we've been given because it multiplies. I remember one time coming home from college, and I told Mom about that. And so she was at the counter one day chopping carrots, and I said, you know, it just occurred to me, I don't hear you play anymore. Mom taught me how to play piano in kindergarten. And so she's chopping carrots, and I said, how come you don't play the piano anymore? She didn't say anything. I said, did you hear what I said? She said, I heard what you said. I said, well, why don't you play anymore? And she said, I stopped when you got better than I was. And I felt so sad. Because she was the one who taught me. She was the one who helped me to have a love of music, okay? So that's what happens when you kind of hide your talents. I already tell her that I use this in the homily, so don't worry. Oh, Johnny, I wish you'd shut up. So what does this bring us to? This is the point, I think. You and I live in a part of the world that is blessed more than most places. We just forget about that. We are so wildly blessed. Even those of us among us who think we have the least, we have more than most people in the world, and we just don't get that. We are so wildly blessed, and we just kind of take it for granted. Let me give you a real story as an example of how radically blessed we are. We don't see it. There was a woman from Africa who came to give a talk in the United States, and she was staying with a woman professor at her apartment. And so the first morning, the woman had a little table out on her deck, and she probably made muffins and coffee and juice. So they're sitting out there having a little conversation. The woman's looking in the backyard, and she stopped her and she said, who lives over there? And the woman said, nobody lives over there. So that conversation continued, and she's looking around. She's still looking over in this direction. She said, whose house is that? She says, nobody's house. And so they went on talking, and finally she could tell she was really distracted because she kept looking over, and she said, are you sure nobody lives there? And she said, where? And she said, over there. And she said, oh, that's not a house, that's a garage. And she said, what's a garage? Well, she says, it's where I keep my car. And the woman's eyes got really wide, and she said, a house for a car. A house for a car. Now, I'm not suggesting you go home and tear down your machine shed. But what I am saying is this: look how radically different our perspective is. Where this woman came from, people didn't have a place to live. And she had a house for a car. So what's this boil down to? Every one of us, just like the gospel, has been given talents, each according to our ability. They're all different, but each according to our ability. And the least thing we should do is to hide them and bury them, because it's not ours in the first place. So those of you who are in business know that the bottom line at the end of the year is your ROI, your return on investment. And that's exactly what these entrustments are. Our life, our faith, our family, our friends, our ability to work, our income, our accomplishments, those are entrustments. Entrustments. And God really expects us to make a difference. The reason Christ came to earth was to transform people and to change their lives. And we need to remind ourselves, all we need to do is use Jesus as our example, that his ministry was always about feeding people and healing people. Pretty fundamental things, radical things that change their life. All of us can do that. Some can do it to a greater capacity, some can do it to less, but everybody can do that. But it's directly based not on what you have, but on your ability to remember how much is gift and what we have to be grateful for. That's what it's about. So I want to leave you with the challenge. We've got Advent starting in a couple weeks. That's the end of the liturgical year and the beginning of the new church year. And then, of course, we have a new year starting in January. I want you to start thinking now about what you personally are going to do in a concrete, specific way to alleviate the poor. None of us can change the world, but doing little things ourselves can change the world around us. Okay? And I'm asking that myself. Nobody's busier than I am. We're all busy. So it's not about, well, I really don't have time for that. We need to figure that out. Because one day, Jesus is going to sit us on probably a kind of stiff-back chair and say, whatsoever you did to the least of my people, what did you do for me? What'd you do? How will we answer?